Hello everyone, my name is Dmitry Rogozhny, and today we'll be looking at the implementation details of the links tree web part. So the last time we've seen this web part, which allows to define different categories and then navigate these categories to eventually get to a particular content. For example, here I've got a list of Office 365 products, and I can select a product to view categories of training materials available for this product, and eventually I can select a specific article and view this article in an iframe. So that's the links tree web part. And before we'll take a look at the source code, let me quickly recap the configuration options that we've got for this web part. And if you'd like to view the full functional overview, refer to the previous video where I did exactly that. So for the configuration, we can specify an optional title for the web part, and also we can specify a list of categories that we'd like to show. This is defined as a JSON object. For example, let me select Outlook, Quick Start, and add an email account to Outlook. So if we'll take a look at the categories JSON object, we can see that here we've got this object called with the property name equal to Outlook. So here we'll have a name and a key. Also there can be optional description and URL. And for an object, we'll have a list of subcategories, which will be Quick Start. So you can see here, so the Outlook will have the Quick Start as the subcategory, and Quick Start will have its own name, key, description, and URL, and also a list of its own subcategories. And here we've got the add an email account to Outlook. And this object, it does not have any subcategories, but it has got additional property called content, which will store a link to the training material that we will show in the iframe. So this way, using the JSON object, we can define the structure of our categories. Also, we can select whether to show breadcrumbs. So for example, if I'll select show always, and now when I will select categories, you can see that I can see the path to a particular content in the breadcrumbs menu. And also there's the selector for the content viewer, so we can specify that we'd like to display content in an iframe, like in this case, or we can render content as a list of links. Okay, so that's it for the configuration. Now let's take a look at the implementation details. So I've got this project opened in the Visual Studio Code, and it is a SharePoint framework project. So here in the web parts folder, I've got two web parts, and the one that we're going to look at today is the links tree. So if I'll open this web part, let's take a look first at the property pane configuration. So here's the get property pane configuration function. Here we define a code editor for as the field for our JSON that describes our categories, and also we've got two drop downs, one for breadcrumb and one for content viewer type. And the code editor field, it comes from the SPFX property controls package, which is a set of reusable property pane controls, and drop downs are the standard fields. And in the render function, we can see that I'm using the links tree component. We provide some properties for this component, such as the data provider, and we'll take a look at that later. Title, whether to show breadcrumbs, and the content viewer type. And we render this links tree React component. So if we'll take a look at the components for this web part, you can see that there's the links tree, and also there's a set of components such as the breadcrumb, category browser, category nav, and content view. So once again, let me switch back to the SharePoint page. So let's take a look at this web part. So we can see that there's the web part title, breadcrumb menu, lists of categories, which will depend on the currently selected categories, and eventually we may display some content. And so I've prepared an image that outlines different components and their responsibility. So here at the top we've got the links tree component, and you can see that it contains two components. So the first one will be web part title for the title of the web part, and the second one will be category browser, outlined in black here. So this category browser will contain breadcrumb component. It will render several category nav components. So each one will have each one will render a list of categories, a particular level of categories, right? So in this case, we will have 3 category nav components, and also we will have a content view component which will render a content. So hope this will make it easier to understand what's going on with all these components. So in the links tree component, let's take a look at the render function. So here it is, and we can see that in the render function we are calling the render browser function, which is defined right here. So here we check whether we've got any categories to display in the state of the component, and if no categories are available, we will render a placeholder component asking for the configuration. And if we've got categories to display, we will render the web part title and a category browser. And for a category browser component, we will provide selected categories. So it will be a list of categories that are currently selected, categories that we need to display, handler in the case when someone will click on a category, content to render, breadcrumb visibility is responsible for whether we need to display breadcrumbs, and content viewer type is the type of the content viewer to apply. Okay, so before looking at the category browser component, let's take a look at where this list of categories come from. So we can see that it comes from state, right? So if we'll go all the way up to the constructor, we can see that here in the state of this component we store categories that should be displayed, selected categories, and the content. So once again, let me switch to the image. So in our case, selected categories will be Outlook, Quick Start, and add an email account to Outlook. So list of selected categories will have three objects describing categories. So one for Outlook, second one will be for Quick Start, and the third one will be for add an email account to Outlook. So you can think of that as the path that is currently selected in our structure. Categories will be will store lists of categories that should be displayed. So in categories, in this particular case that you can see here, we will have 3 lists. one list for root categories, so this right here. So this will be a list of categories with Office 365 products. Second list of categories will be for Outlook, and the third list will be for Quick Start category. So it will contain add an email account to Outlook, create and send email in Outlook, and so on. So we'll have three lists with different categories that we need to display. Okay, now that we know what will be in our state, we can take a look at how this data will get into this state in the first place. So, and for this, we will take a look at the component.mount function, which is a part of the React lifecycle. So, in this function, we will take the data provider that is defined in properties, and we will call first of all restore selected categories function. And before looking at this function, let me quickly go back. So I'd like you to pay attention to the hash part of the URL. So right now it contains path equal to Outlook, and every time I select a new category, this path got updated. So it can be used to, so we can use this particular URL to specify to this particular state of the web part. So if I'll reload the page, you can see that I will have these categories selected by default, and this information is taken from the hash part of the URL. So here we've got Outlook and Quick Start as selected path. So if I'll go back to the source code, so this function will take the URL, it will take its hash, and it will return a list of selected categories. And then we will have these selected categories, and we can call the function called set categories and content, and we'll provide the data provider and the list of selected categories to this function. So here's this function, and in this function we will call get categories function, providing once again the data provider and selected categories. So this function will return lists of categories for the selected path. What it means is that once again, for this particular case, selected categories will contain these three categories: Outlook, Quick Start, and add an email account to Outlook. And categories will contain three lists. So this one for products, this one for Outlook, and this one for Quick Start. So this is the information that we need to render this presentation. So this get categories will return these lists. Get content will return the content if it's available for this particular selected path. And both these functions will return promises. So we are using promise all function to wait for these promises to resolve, and we will get categories and content, and we will store them in state, which will force a rendering, and this way we will render the React component with this updated information. And if we'll take a look at the get categories function, we can see that it asks the data provider for the categories. So using the get root to get the root categories, and get by path to get the categories for a particular path. So I think it's a good time to look at the data provider. So the interface for the data provider is specified in the iData provider interface. So we've got 4 functions here. GetRoot should return list of categories for root. GetByPath will return a list of categories for currently selected path, or for the paths provided by this as an argument. GetCategoriesByKeys is basically the same as GetByPath, but instead of categories, we specify our path as the list of keys. So it will be array of strings in this case. And the last function is getContent. So with the specified path of categories, we either return a content, or if there's no content, we'll return undefined. And there's one provider implemented that implements this interface. It's called JSON data provider. So in the constructor, we get the string, which we parse into as a JSON, and we use this JSON object, and we've seen this object in the properties property pane for the web part. So we are using this JSON to return these categories and content data. And as you can see, all these functions, they return promises instead of directly returning the content. So you can have asynchronous implementation for your data provider. For example, we can implement a data provider for a document library. So it will have folders as categories, and a list of documents as a particular content. So we can implement a provider that will allow us to navigate the folder structure for document library, and so on. So we can have different types of JSON data providers if we'd like to. And for the JSON provider, there's a folder called demo, which contains a couple of sample JSON objects. For example, for the Office 365 products, we've got this all 365 categories tree JSON, which provides an example structure with categories, subcategories, and eventually the content that we would like to display. Okay, so that's it for the data provider part. So let's get back to the links tree component. So now this component has got all the data. So the selected categories and categories that we need to display, and the content. And once again, let me show you the render part. So now we can render a web part title and the category browser. So the category browser in here. So as you can see, it's a functional component. So it will return what should be rendered. So this component does not have any own state. So it uses only properties provided to this component. So here's the return statement, and here we call the render breadcrumbs function, which will, depending on the specified visibility, will either return null or will render a breadcrumb component. Also, it will call the getNavs to get a list of navigation content navs components to render, and eventually it will and also it will call a render content to render a content view. So once again, before looking at details, here we've got this category browser component outlined in black. So it needs to render a breadcrumb, which is in blue, a list of category nav components for each list of categories. So in this case, we need to render 3 category nav components, and the content view component for the content. So let's go back. And so here in the render breadcrumbs, we check for the visibility, and if we need to, we render breadcrumb component. So if we'll take a look at this component, once again, it's a functional component, and in its return statement, you can see that it returns the breadcrumb UI fabric, which is the component from the Office UI fabric package. So we are using standard Office UI React components to render our breadcrumbs. And back to the category browser. So now we've got breadcrumbs. We need to render a list of category navigations. So we've got getNavs function for that. So if I'll scroll up, you can see that we take a list of categories, and for each list we return a category nav component. And if I'll look inside the category nav component, we can see it is a functional component which renders here it is, which renders the nav component. And nav is the here you can see we are using the Office UI Fabric React package once again to render a list of links for a category. So we are using the standard Office UI Fabric component to with some additional styling applied, and there's nothing tricky here. And the last part is render content. So we're checking whether we've got content to render, and if we do, we are rendering the content view component. So content view component, let's take a look at the return statement. So here we've got a switch, and depending on the specified viewer type, if it's an iframe, we return an iframe with a link to the content, and if it's a list of links, we will render a list of links. And that's it. So just to recap, we've got let me go back here. So we've got links tree web part, which renders a links tree, and this links tree component will contain a web part title and category browser. So the links tree component is responsible for storing the currently selected categories, a list of categories, and the content. And so it does that by using the React state, and also it works with a data provider to access to request information about categories and the content. And inside the category browser, we've got the breadcrumb component, which shows breadcrumb menu. We will have several category nav components for each category. Whoop. And also we'll have a content view component, which is responsible for rendering content. And that's it. So there's quite a lot of moving parts in here, but eventually we're using lots of Office UI Fabric components for the means of representation, such as we're using the breadcrumb, and we're using nav component to show these lists. We'll just apply additional styles for this sliding effect, and the selection style is different from the default one, but basically I'm trying to reuse Office UI Fabric components as much as possible to make the implementation easy. So that's it for today. The link to the GitHub repository with this solution will be available in the description, and I will see you next time. Bye!